Hello, I'm your host, Cheryl Espinosa-Jones, and I want to welcome you to Good Grief, where we talk each week about the transformations that can come from loss. Today I'm welcoming Maura Casey. Maura grew up in an Irish-American family in Buffalo, New York, the youngest of six children. For more than 30 years, Casey was an opinion writer for three New England newspapers and the New York Times, where she had a seat on the exalted Times editorial board. Over the course of her career, Casey won 45 state, regional, and national awards for her writing. She and her husband Pete have two adult children and two grandchildren. They live on a small Connecticut farm with their two dogs and a barn cat. She writes a weekly column called Casey's Catch on Substack. And when the breeze is right, she coasts on Long Island Sound in her sailboat, Second Wind. Saving Ellen, the book we're here to discuss today, is her first book, and you can find out more about her at caseyinc.com. Welcome, Maura.
Hey, thank you, Cheryl. So nice to be here, and thank you for having me.
Nice to have you. And I want to start by saying that um, the thing that stands out about your memoir, I've read hundreds of memoirs, honestly, uh, is that you captured the complex way in which different factors affect our development.
Yes.
So in your case, alcoholism, um, a member of the family being ill over a long period of time, sexual assault, you kind of wove it all together in a way that is actually pretty hard to do. So applaud
Thank you.
on that.
Great.
But I can't imagine you having left any of those elements out because they all affected each other, didn't they?
They did, and I've been a writer for a long time, and I thought this is not going to be a problem. But to write about the really hard memories, Mary Carr's Art of Memoir had a really interesting exercise that I kind of dove into. She recommended that people who wanted to do that write out that memory using all five senses, make it as detailed as possible, just go on and on and on, and then put it in a drawer and walk away for a while, and then see how you feel about writing it for the public because it's a vulnerable thing to do. And I did that, and I found it just a terrific exercise. And it did get me from feeling a little self-conscious to saying, okay, now I can do this. But maybe I needed um, that way of kind of opening it up and realizing what I could say and what I couldn't say, and finally resolving it's okay. So
Well, the thing
that's
I, the
what I
thing I,
did.
I'm doing some memoir typewriting at
Mhm.
the moment, and the thing I'm aware of, and I've had other people talk about it, is sometimes it's hard to get past the sense of protection for people who are still living, you know, um, and it can be a struggle. But if you originally write it only for yourself, that
Right.
I think that does help, doesn't it? Then you can
It
tell, am
does.
I protecting them or am I protecting myself? You know, I don't know if
Exactly.
I ran into that, but of course, a
Right.
lot of the major characters, your family members in your memoir, are not living. And I wonder if there's a sense that you became better ready to write it now that they are not living. Is there,
It's definitely easier. But I think that even if they were alive, I wouldn't have any problem because I was a columnist for a long time and an opinion writer. And, it's part of the deal. I'm sorry you're related to me. Let me apologize about that. But that said, my brother Tim and my sister Claudia, who do figure in the book, my sister Kate less so, are alive, and I let them know what I was writing, and they were fine with it. Um, I I do think that it's easier when they're safely 6 feet under,
Hmm.
and maybe it's easier when you've had some years to get some perspective. Uh, in any event, I've wanted to write a book for a long time, but in many ways, maybe I had to wait this long to be ready, you know? Can't write a book before you're ready.
That's for sure. I mean, some people can apparently, but not me. I,
Right.
I
Okay.
have to be ready. So let's really get into the story of your family. Um,
Okay.
it sounds like you originally perceived being Irish as heavily invested in alcohol, lots of
Absolutely.
drinking, lots of normalization of drinking,
Mhm.
and including having no problem with your parents had no problem with you drinking at a very young age, which
Right.
of course does favor alcoholism if you've got
Exactly.
that inclination. Um, and then into that atmosphere, it sounds to me, but you can affirm or deny, like nobody at the time maybe considered your mom an alcoholic, but everybody knew your father was. Is it
Yes.
fair to say?
Absolutely. And it's also fair, oddly, and this really kind of sort of at the very end of the book, I get into this a little bit. I ended up going into the alcoholism field as a counselor, and I married somebody who was a counselor. And from that, I realized that whatever my mother's drinking was like, it didn't have the negative impact on us as my father's drinking. She didn't act out. She didn't, there was no scenes, that sort of thing. So my father drank pretty heavily, and it got worse after my sister got sick. I think he probably had a problem for quite some time, but it really got out of control once the pressure cooker was on for the whole family, and Ellen was desperately ill, and I think he felt really trapped. I'm not certain if he wasn't such a Catholic, he would have had 6 kids. And I'm glad they didn't stop at number 5 because I was number 6. But my mother had to step it up and just say, "Look, we got to go on birth control." And he said, "But we'll go to hell." And she said, "I'm in hell now." So, then that fixed that. But there was an awful lot of drinking. The atmosphere was full of drinking, and Dad's drinking had a very negative impact on the family. At the same time, nobody blamed the alcohol because alcohol was a beloved member of the family almost. And all the adults in my world thought that if, a teenager drank at home, it was better to learn how to handle it. Now we know through research that's pretty conclusive that the earlier you start drinking, the more you set yourself up for developing problems later on, which of course happened to me. So, for whatever reason, blame the culture, blame the norms at the time. Yeah, I started when I was 13.
Uh, the the um the current version of that is not wanting your kid to preferring if they're going to drink that it happen when without involving cars and
Right,
dangerous parties and stuff, but still a dangerous practice. So into, a bit of a teetering situation came your sister's illness.
right.
And I felt as if I got to know the person before the illness more
Hmm.
than I would expect, given how young you were when she became ill.
Right,
That very lively, very energetic.
right,
And so the contrast between that and what happened when she developed kidney disease
right.
was quite stark. Yes?
Yes, indeed. Ellen was loud. She was charismatic. She was just a spitfire, a ball of energy. And my mother used to introduce her to people by saying, "This is my daughter Ellen. She's going to be the first female president of the United States." Now this is in the 60s, which is a really radical statement. But kidney disease then was considered almost always terminal. And kidney transplants were like walking on the moon. I mean, they almost didn't happen. There was no donor network, and it was tenuous at best for it even to work. It was very early on. And so the treatment involved basically taking a person to the edge of starvation, hoping too many things didn't go wrong, and tying a knot and hanging on and hoping somebody would come up with a treatment or a cure.
I was actually somewhat, I mean, it made sense once I took it in, but I was somewhat surprised at at how much treatment for that illness has advanced since then.
Amazing. It's
I mean,
amazing.
really, and it's true of lots of illnesses. You
It's
know, my first wife died of a cancer that people live with for a long time now, for instance.
Oh,
She
wow.
happened to live a fairly long time, but she was an outlier. And now
Wow.
regularly people live quite a long time with that illness, for
Isn't that
better or for
amazing?
worse. It is amazing. Um, and I'm going to ask you to read a section
Okay.
that has to do with, I believe in telling kids the truth.
Hmm.
And with my wife's illness, we were very truthful. Not not to scare them, just because it was happening, they were going to feel it. But it sounds to me, I'm going to have you read this part about your denial being broken. Um,
Hmm.
it seems to me that that wasn't the rule at the time, and that perhaps your mother felt guilty that you came to know about it.
Oh, yeah. Well, so this is from chapter 14. And this segment, I'll just start by saying once in a while, something broke through denial. One day I walked home from fifth grade to find my mother home instead of visiting Ellen at the hospital. I was happy to see her, but as I put down my books, I sensed something was wrong. She seemed strangely quiet and was staring into space. She mechanically turned her head toward me at the sound of my greeting, and I could see her face was pale and drawn. Mora, Mom blurted out, her voice shaking. Dr. Hardy told me today that Ellen will die before she turns 18. I was stunned. Dr. Hardy was our pediatrician, kind and easy to talk to. We all trusted him, and yet with this pronouncement, he became a witch doctor. He may as well have placed a voodoo curse on Ellen and our entire family. Mom had gone to see him because she wanted a clearer prognosis concerning Ellen's illness. She wondered when all the treatments and all the interventions would have a positive effect. She wanted her Ellie back, her energetic Ellie. Dr. Hardy sighed and told her that Ellen would never get better. In fact, he explained, all the treatments were just delaying her inevitable demise. The kidney disease that Ellen had was always fatal. Already, specialists struggled to slow the course of her illness. Dr. Hardy could not envision any plausible scenario in which Ellen would live to adulthood. Enjoy your daughter while you can, he said, shaking his head. Be grateful you have a big family. You have other children. Take comfort in them. This was 1967. Kidney transplants, now so ordinary, were then so rare as to be almost experimental and didn't work for long. There is no organ donor network. There is no computerized system to match unrelated donors with patients. Renal disease treatment amounted to trying everything to stall the illness in the hopes that new treatments would come along. Delay was the name of the game. It brought time and little more. Dr. Hardy was blunt. Barring a miracle, my sister's days were numbered. I was outraged and determined to comfort my mother. What did he know anyway? I argued. Could he see the future? Did he have a crystal ball? Everything is going to be all right, Mom. You wait and see. My mother looked at me in gratitude, and then she crumpled in guilt. I shouldn't have told you, she whispered. Now you'll worry. I forced myself to smile. Mom, come on. Doctors don't know absolutely everything. Yet the doctor's pronouncement was an unbearable burden. Now I knew how sick Ellen was, how dim were the hopes for her recovery. She might never again throw a football with our brothers. Getting back to our normal lives seemed like a fantasy. Consumed with dark thoughts, I pushed them away. I couldn't believe that Ellen would die, I told myself. She would get better. She had to.
So some denial was able to be maintained.
Yes,
Uh, and by the way, this is a sidelight of that reading, but no parent ever should hear take comfort in your other children as if any one child can replace any other child.
right.
Such a pressing, I've heard that so often with people whose children have died, at least, which of course any sentence that starts at least when it comes to grief is
Right.
probably going to go wrong, but at
Yeah,
least
right.
their children, that's a crushing thing to hear. It so ignores the main subject, which is the loss.
Right. It's
Um,
so ham-handed.
she had lost her healthy child. You talk a lot about your mom showing great courage because, of course, she pushed to be the donor for your sister,
Right.
and it didn't sound as if she quite had the health for it.
No.
And I agree that that was courageous, but also, would it have been more courageous than living with the idea that your sister would die? It's
Well, exactly.
quite a rock and a hard place there.
Right. When I really looked at it, and really examined everything with all my research, I thought honestly that my brother Seamus should have been the one. Any one of us who would donate, any one of his Ellen's brothers or sisters, first of all, we had to have the right blood type. So that eliminated me. That eliminated Kate. That eliminated Tim. But Seamus and Claudia and my mother were still there. And my brother was very close to being 21, which is like the age of consent. So I really thought, honestly, on paper, he would have been perfect. But to a mother who says, no, I don't want my children to be compromised. I have one child who's already deathly ill. I don't want to compromise the health of another. I can totally get why she pushed for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I suppose there is more risk in someone losing a kidney quite young, uh,
Right.
giving a kidney. I mean, probably no problems, but I can see where she would um, be quite hesitant to push him to do it.
Well, and I think that my mother was the one who talked to the doctor, so she filtered everything. And I think um, she filtered their discussions in a way that made it obvious that she was the
That it
one.
was going to be her. She made that decision before
Right.
bringing it up with anybody. We're going to take a break and come back in a few minutes. Listeners, you can go to my website, goodgriefwithcheryl.com. Go to all my social media. It's linked there. And to find Maura Casey, go to caseyinc.com. Be back soon. Welcome back. This is your host, Cheryl Espinosa-Jones, and I've been talking with Maura Casey about her book, Saving Ellen. So, your mother made this decision,
Hmm?
and suddenly, I guess we're in miracle territory because your
Right.
sister lived for some time. But what stood out to me about it is that when something like that happens, which seems like the end of the illness story, like
Right.
someone is no evidence of disease with cancer or get a transplant, you're not going to die. There's this assumption the story is over, but it actually is not over. The person will deal with that probably their whole lives. And of
It's
course, that was
never.
true of your sister, but was there a sense in the atmosphere surrounding you, oh, good, that's over now? People around you?
I always thought if she would just get a transplant, if she would just get well, life would be normal again, the clock would be reset, and it would be like it was, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's never going to happen. What I was too young to understand was that, yeah, okay, you have a kidney transplant, but it doesn't mean your health is going to be the same as it was before you got sick. It's not going to happen. Then the state-of-the-art way to treat the aftermath of a transplant and to prevent rejection was massive steroid doses, massive. And I didn't realize how high it was until I tracked down Ellen's doctor, the only one who's still around, who was a very young doctor then, and easy to track down because it was Mary Hawking, sister of Stephen Hawking. So I thought, well, this is easy. He's world famous,
You should
you
be around
know.
there somewhere.
I'll bet he's got a foundation and she's on the board. And I was exactly right. So I emailed her, and within 5 hours, I got an email back saying how lovely to hear from you. And she put together a lot of the pieces for me. Ellen was on 200 milligrams of steroids every day to prevent rejection. Now, this was better than the state of the art 7 years earlier when they would expose a patient to full body irradiation to prevent rejection. This is how kind of really rather primitive it was.
Mhm.
So, having steroids, the mood swings, the insomnia, all that stuff, which Ellen very courageously tried to manage. But the one side effect was really large stretch marks, wide and kind of all over her body, which she
The
thought,
weight
okay,
gain. From the weight gain,
from
yes.
the weight gain and the fact that the steroids had an impact almost like thinning your skin. And so these were not the stretch marks that women fuss over, the little white things after you've been pregnant. No, they were like red stripes in her arms and underneath her breasts and behind her legs. And she was horrified, but she thought, well, this is going to go away. And she said to her doctor, when will this go away? And he just looked at her, a surgeon, and he just said, oh, those are never going to go away. Bye. See you next month. And it was really a lot for her to take. And knowing what I know now and at the age I am, I just think that poor kid, she gets through all this. And then as an adolescent, she's dealing with really disfiguring side effect and mood swings and everything else. And so it's very complicated. It's a very complicated life after you've had a transplant, even today. And then it was even more so.
I'm thinking about, a term that maybe is some people think is overused these days, trauma healing.
Yes.
However, it has a lot of potent meaning, and
Mhm.
there's trauma to her. That's what you're describing.
Right.
But but also, I was told once that the worst form of torture for a person is to have a loved relative of theirs tortured in front of them.
Right.
So I wonder if you see yourself as having been traumatized by that experience.
I think it was, and Ellen and I had a really interesting experience years later when my father got sick and had complications after a heart bypass surgery. She just said to me, he was in ICU for 3 months. And she said to me, I never realized how hard this was for all of you.
Mm.
I would have much preferred to be in the hospital bed instead of dad. And I was just beside myself while he was in the hospital. And it is, but you even feel guilty in feeling that, oh, this is so hard. I'm going through this thing because the person you love is undergoing the real trauma, and you feel like you don't have the right to even complain about your part in this little drama.
And yet, of course, looking back, it's not true, right?
Right.
You were all experiencing it. I'm sure it affected each one of you differently. And everyone but her was stuffing it
Right.
with alcohol, right? So,
Right, or whatever, or something. I mean, we're trying to figure it out in each in our own ways. When I sent draft of this memoir to my beloved brother Tim, who only appears like twice in the book, Tim dealt with it by just running away. He was 7 years older than me. He got an apartment and moved out as soon as he could. He moved to Australia to teach. I mean, how much farther away could you get with the aftermath of all this? And he felt bad about it. And yet I said to him, if I wrote a memoir in the last 30 years, you would like be my guy because he lives an hour from me. We're very close. I named my son after him. So it's interesting about how each of us handled it. And I discovered booze, and God, I thought that was great.
it solved the problem.
Hey, I felt like, all was right with the world.
It's not solved, right?
Right. Marvelous.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. There's a weight of guilt no matter how you cut it, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and that's got such an outsized impact on children and
Right.
and teenagers, young people, because um, most of us at that period anyway, were not taught that it wasn't our fault, that we
Right.
still deserved attention and love, all the things.
Absolutely.
Um, More of a tendency to just go on. Yes?
Exactly. And at the time, family therapy, counseling wasn't as broadly accepted, at least, and my mother just thought the whole thing would be a violation of privacy, which is ridiculous. But I get it. That was the culture at the time. And now there's much more of an understanding. There's a big impact here. Let's talk about the whole family and how everyone's doing. And then it was kind of like every man for himself. Get in the lifeboats while you can.
Don't air the dirty laundry, possibly not even to each other.
Right, right. So there's the cone of silence is a reality.
Right. Um, that seems a good time really to kind of switch a bit to the other huge thing going on in all of your lives, which was the worsening of your dad's illness, of
Right.
alcoholism. Would you read you you'd called this chapter "Booze, the Center of Life,"
Yeah.
which did amuse me quite a bit. But it does seem like that's how you all felt,
Right.
and you just faulted him with not being able to handle it very well.
Right. Exactly.
But he really couldn't handle it very well. That's for sure.
No, and it was complicated because he was having a very public affair with a woman who we all knew who had 9 kids, and I was going to school with one of them in my class, and it was just an absurd situation. And if alcoholism was bad, but if he just was an alcoholic and that was it, okay, but he diverted his resources to take his girlfriend out. And we were getting less and less money to have decent food and things like that in the house.
Isn't it almost, I know this does not feel comical, but there's a certain irony to the fact that he said to your mother that if they used birth control, they'd go to hell.
Right.
And yet, of course, adultery is also also a sin. I know some things about Catholicism that the two never crossed paths in his mind, or did they?
So I think that there was a lot of rationalization in his mind until much later when he really, really repented the whole thing. But what began to happen is that he and his girlfriend would go to mass together. They would go to mass together. And good old Father Garvey, the pastor of the church, wasn't stupid. When they went up for Holy Communion, he would skip them, which outraged my father, just outraged him. But the neighbors noticed, you know? So yeah, lots of magical thinking going on, I think.
Indeed. Would you
So
and probably helped along by alcohol. It's hard to see clearly when there's a whole lot of alcohol going on.
it's very hard to see clearly. So I'll read from chapter 18, Booze, the Center of Life. When Dad began drinking, tension rose. It was only a matter of time for arguing to start. Eventually, Dad would leave, slamming the door. And yet, our mother drank too. Whiskey was her choice drug of choice, with ice, a little water, and a splash of ginger ale. Most of the time, Mom drank socially with others who were drinking just as much. But when she was alone and imbibed, a pall fell over her that was very different from my father's boozing. Getting drunk never sparked my mother's rage. She didn't start fights over imagined slights or thwarted ambition. Instead, when she drank, if she drank alone, my mother would brood, playing solitaire over and over while she silently mulled over an issue or the nature of life itself. Often, when I would come home, when I walked into the house in Anderson Place, and I would hear the notes of John Sibelius's violin concerto, that weeping violin, I would feel an urge to flee. The sounds of ice rattling in a glass and the Finnish composer's concerto in D minor usually meant that Mom was not only drinking but depressed. It occurred often enough that I became hyper vigilant for the signs that my strong, funny, and optimistic mother was tumbling, at least temporarily, into darkness.
You don't go into how you finally identified alcohol as the problem that it was for everybody, including you. But you got it kind of full on at some point.
Yes.
And I know from having lots of clean and sober people in my life that there's often they say you have to reach your bottom, but I've known kind of shallow bottoms and deep bottoms. What finally got that across to you?
Well, two things. Number one, when I became a counselor, um, at a homeless shelter, I always say to people, I met my husband in a homeless shelter, but he wasn't a client. He was on staff also. And the management offered to send me to the Rutgers School of Alcohol Studies, which takes place for several weeks, 3 weeks in the summer in July. And it's like you take courses from 9 in the morning till 9 at night. I mean, it's very intense. And I took courses in family alcoholism, and it was like, ugh! It was like watching a Stephen King movie. It was like the total horror of realizing what really happened in my family and being able to connect the dots. I was living at home at the time. When I came back from Rutgers, I moved out within a week.
Hmm.
I couldn't take it. But I still had a degree of denial about my own drinking until one day when I was 28 and I had been married for 2 years, I went to a journalism conference, and at the time, and for all I know, this still happens, there's a lot of heavy drinking. And I said to myself, it was around, before Christmas, we were going to a wonderful restaurant in Annapolis and the lights in the harbor. I would have one drink, maybe two. Well, I drank all night. And when we took a bus back to the hotel, where they had arranged for a bus for us, thank God. No, none of us drove. Someone pulled a case of champagne on the bus. And I decided it was my responsibility to help knock off that case of champagne with about four other people. So I drank till 3 in the morning. And when I stumbled into my bed, every time I closed my eyes, I felt nauseated. Every time I opened my eyes, the room would spin. And I just said, but I thought I was only going to have two drinks. And the next morning, I looked in the mirror and I just saw an alcoholic looking back at me. And I just said, I'm done. I know how this movie ends, and it's not good. And I got lots of good stuff happening in my life right now, and I am done. I didn't talk to my husband about it, but we went home to Buffalo for Christmas, and I went to a bar a block from my father's house where I grew up, and it was owned by Greeks who saw me. They're accustomed to me drinking heavily, and they sent over to our table a tray of shots of ouzo
Mm.
and like
We
ten shots of ouzo on the house. And I panicked and I began to give them to everybody else, anyone else. And my husband looked at me and said, "Oh, are you going to join AA now?" And I said, "Maybe." And that's the first time he knew that I had stopped, and I never had another drink.
we're going to talk about that a little more because, as I know, quitting on a dime, then things start coming out because, and something kept you committed to that and supported in that. So I'm
Right.
real curious about that. Let's come to
Okay.
that. Come back in a few minutes and talk about that.
Very good.
Listeners, you can go to goodgriefwithcheryl.com to find links to all things me, or to find Maura Casey, go to caseyinc.com. It's CASEY, in case that isn't clear. Back after the break. Welcome back. I'm your host, Cheryl Espinosa-Jones, and I've been talking with Maura Casey about her book, Saving Ellen. And before the break, Maura, we were diving into that moment. Sometimes people have to have several moments, but you had one very dramatic moment, went, no more. And you
Right.
stuck with it, which actually is hard to do. Congratulations on that. But what do you feel helped you stick with it?
Well, honestly, this is going to sound so crazy, but my husband, Pete, whose last name is Panzarella, is about half or a third Irish, but he's mostly Italian, and he doesn't give a tinker's damn about drinking alcohol. He was always quite happy with having one drink, maybe a beer a week just to keep his hand in. He almost never has two. I'm not sure. I think we've been married for 41 years, and I might have seen him three times have more than one beer. And so it was the simplest thing in the world to live with him and not drink because he didn't care about it. It really wasn't in the house. He was just happy to have a soda or lemonade, and he was great. And so that was a big deal. I didn't have to live with someone who was drinking every day or who was looking at me and saying, "What's the matter with you?" And so that was huge. In terms of AA, I didn't go until I had a couple of friends who I knew were sober. It was just easier to me to go into one of those church basements with a friend. And I was also really busy, so I kind of didn't bother and stumbled along myself, did a lot of reading, and messed around with the steps. But I've been to AA a lot, and I've never been to a bad AA meeting, but it was just more helpful for me to go with somebody. And when I had someone to go with, I had a girlfriend who we would go on our lunch hour together. It was much easier. It was easier to get sober friends, and that was great. And in fact, I think at some newspapers I worked at, I might have been looked upon as a little standoffish because I wasn't going out with everybody for a beer after deadline. I wasn't doing any of that stuff, and I didn't want to. So, in a funny way, when I look back on my newspaper career, I think, gee, I would have made more friends if I had been drinking, but, it was a good choice not to.
Well, there's two things in that. There's the not drinking, and then there's the um, protecting yourself from being in drinking environments, uh,
Right.
which not everybody does that, right? Some people go out and sit there with soda water or whatever they do. But that just maybe sounded like a bore. I don't know.
I
Do you,
had to wait until I was well along in sobriety before I could do that. It was probably 10 years before I could walk into a liquor store without wanting to flee. And it was probably 10 years before I realized not only did I have nothing to be ashamed of, because I always felt secretly ashamed of it, but that I had done something really cool. It was good that I broke this chain that, frankly, if you shake my family tree, a drunk will fall off every branch, that I had broken that chain and my kids were going to grow up with a mother who didn't drink, and that was a good thing.
and your sister too, the one who had the kidney transplant. It was I kind of dropped my jaw a little bit that she was a heavy drinker because you'd think that might not be the best thing when you
Right.
have a delicate um
Well,
kidney.
right. She became a terrifying to me binge drinker. She would drink for 4 days straight and then not have a drop for a year and a half, you know?
You never
But
knew it was coming then, right?
except, when she was on like one of these benders, it was really scary. And frankly, this is where I always talk about there is great power in the power of example. I had an example of a journalist, Joanna Ragg, who was at the Miami Herald, who didn't drink. And she was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and I wanted to be like her. I stopped drinking, and Ellen saw that I had stopped drinking, the first person in my family to do so. And she thought, if Maura did it, so could I. And so my simply stopping helped her.
That
And if that didn't convince her, so did getting a DWI, which was very deeply unpleasant for her.
it's interesting to me because, of course, I know quite a bit about AA, all the 12-step programs, and you're not supposed to proselytize, but the fact is that people affect each other. That's what you're talking about. That you didn't have to say anything to her. You had to do what was right for you, and it ended up impacting her, right?
Right, right,
So I want to ask you because what we haven't talked about yet, which is tender, I know, is your early rape.
right,
And I would think the trauma of that. So you were 12 then. You started drinking at 13. Doesn't
right.
seem,
So
you
I
know.
was 12, I wasn't drinking, right?
And so then they say things get stored when you start drinking, and then they're right there for you when you quit. It
Right.
was that your experience? Did some of the various traumas, including that one, did you have to grapple with them when you quit drinking?
I began to grapple with them about 5 years before I stopped drinking but it may have been related to my growing awareness of the place of alcohol in my family life. When I was still working at the homeless shelter, I realized that this thing that happened to me, I really needed some help with. And so I did get counseling, but it was also part of my growing awareness of alcohol and the pile up of crises that I grew up with, that I just said, this has got to affect me as an adult. I need help. And so I began to get help then. And so I think because I did that, it wasn't so much an automatic crisis when I stopped drinking.
You had a little head start on it.
Right, right.
Let's have you read the aftermath, that
Okay.
part of a chapter, and particularly with this in mind, that it captures to me the risk it is to be public, to
Right,
especially for a very young person, the vulnerability. You, I think, notably um, did did tell, right? But
right.
that doesn't mean it would then be easy to deal with, or that you would want to or be prepared to at that point. Could you read that
Sure,
section?
sure. Just as a setup for the readers is I was assaulted on my way home from school, basically, you know, grabbed by a stranger and dragged into the bushes. When I talk about this, people often assume it was a family member. It was not. Total stranger, just to set that up. So every time I came close to forgetting the sexual assault for a while, the police would show up unannounced at our house. They never arrived in an unmarked car. They would park a police cruiser in front of the house and wait for me to come home from school. The policemen were young and usually earnest. They wanted to catch my assailant. They were convinced he lived somewhere in the area. But to find him, they insisted, required driving around the neighborhood with me in the back seat of their police cruiser, scanning the streets on the next to zero chance that I would see my assailant. And then, presumably, they would sprint out of the cruiser and arrest him. I thought the idea was idiotic. I worried that the neighbors would think that I was being arrested. Would they think that I was a repeat shoplifter, seeing me in the back seat of a police cruiser over and over again? Would they look at my parents with sympathy or contempt? My depression deepened. My pretense that everything was fine became harder to keep up. One day in social studies class, I could not stop thinking about the assault, the gag, the book scattering, the hard ground. I felt waves and waves of despair. I am dying, I thought. This is how people feel at the very end of their lives. The teacher's voice telescoped, becoming fainter and fainter. I no longer saw the classroom around me. Instead, I was falling. I was dropping deep into a pit. It was strangely familiar. No light came to this place. The darkness enveloped me. There was only sadness, shame, and pain. I am alone, I thought. I am so alone. And then suddenly, I was not. I felt the presence of God. It was not Jesus, he of the mournful eyes, bleeding hands, and crown of thorn. I heard no angels. I saw no light. I was still in blackness and I saw nothing, but I sensed God all around me, holding me tight against my own despair. And in the blackness, in that pit, God whispered to me, and God said, I am with you in this dark, dark night. I sensed immediately that when I was attacked, when I was raped and experienced that evil, that God was the first to weep. I stayed there for a long time and let God hold me close, and I felt for the first time comfort. Slowly, the teacher's voice returned. I saw light. Slowly, I emerged from the pit. I could see the classroom again, but I didn't know how long I was away. Minutes? Seconds? But God remained. Instinctively, I grasped the meaning of the experience. It was faith founded in knowing, profound yet simple, supple yet steel strong, stripped to its shining core. This was not faith that I had found. Instead, faith found me. I understood that this unmerited grace did not mean that nothing bad would ever happen. Instead, it meant that no matter what, I would never be alone.
So many people that I speak with have the experience of a terrible crashing event in their lives, and they'll say, "How could God let that happen?"
Mm-hmm.
You skipped that part,
I
and
guess
went
so.
to, "I'm not alone in what happened. Bad things
Right,
happen, and I am held. I am um, held in love." And
right.
um, I don't know. I doubt that you're religious. I know you went to Catholic school and went to mass and everything. That doesn't prepare you for that kind of epiphany because in most religious traditions, it's like, be good and bad things won't happen, which
Right,
is
exactly.
absolutely false. I see no reason to believe that, right?
Right.
What do you think helped you skip that part?
I don't know. I was really bullied also in school, and I tracked down my one wonderful friend, Mary Teresa, and she told me that when she saw all of the bullying that took place, it made her an atheist because she thought God should intervene. And I just said, I don't understand Mary Teresa because I really did skip that part, and whatever gift that was, I'm 67 and it's never for a day left me. No matter how bad things have gotten, I always know that there is a sense of, all that is, of, an omnipotent being that's got my back, and I'm grateful for it. Which also made it easy for me to do the 12 steps in AA because I got the whole thing about, I'm not God. I can't do this, and I think I'll let him, which is sort of the part of AA that a lot of people have a
God,
difficult time with.
powerless over my whatever, and
Exactly.
handing it over to a power greater than yourself. Yes. Well, what
Yep.
a blessing that is. I'm sure that supported you all your life, and I'm sure Your family is blessed as a result.
Well, I sent my one son to a Catholic school, and he became an atheist. So I thought, well, that's money well spent. But you know what? It's his life, and he'll find his own way, and whatever.
And of course, there's a lot of sides of the mountain, but
Yeah,
knowing there's a mountain there is a big help, isn't it?
yeah. Well, what I if it comes up, I say to him, well, you know what? You might not believe in God. It doesn't mean he doesn't believe in you. So.
Indeed.
Again, I
So
don't proselytize. This was my experience, and however people come to this is their own journey.
journey, that's right. Good place to end for today. Thanks so much for being with me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Out. You can find more about Casey, Maura Casey at caseyinc.com. I'm going to spell it this time, CASEYINK.com. This has been Good Grief with Cheryl Espinosa-Jones. I look forward to being with you again next week for another meaningful conversation.